Hello everyone, today we talk about Mamluk tactics, specifically referred to the Sultanate and its tactics between the 14th and the 15th centuries. So we have already talked about the Mamluks, of course. We observed, for example, their horsemen, like their average, like violent rank, cavalrymen, their horse archery, their general tactics. Never actually analyzed a single battle, battle video entirely. Today we will refer to some battles. In fact, we will analyze on some other occasions, but we fundamentally concentrate on the, say, tactical model that the Mamluks habitually went at war with. Right, this is naturally a people that fought thousands of engagements that are in part also not recorded, in overwhelming part not reconstructible tactically from the historical evidence. It's also a world which, generally speaking, doesn't have such a wide, insightful, critical literature, right? Historiography, like you can't start finding like consistently in the West at this point, in spite of the usual difficulties in battle, say, arrays, tactics, combat, etc., reconstruction. There are, however, some constants that can be pointed out, and that are somehow part also of a broader tradition. Egypt was sort of a much more Western-looking country compared to the, let's say, the ones hegemonized by the Turkish heavy cavalrymen, the Ghulams, etc. I mean, the Mamluks being these, and having in fact fostered in the same Egypt, Syria, a greater equestrian tradition than before. However, there was also an important infantry base. We do not know much about infantry in Mamluk tactics, and this is an important indicator because we do see that most, of course, Mamluk warfare was about cavalry tactics. And this is part of a broader sort of dynamic that, especially by the time the Mamluks had come into power, overlapped with the Mongol influence. That the Mamluks were able to even fence off essentially the Mongols from Syria, from the destruction of the same Egyptian Sultanate. And I made some videos, for example, about the Wafidiyya, right? Some Mongol troops that were essentially taking refuge in the Sultanate and were settled by the Mamluks as military colonists, mostly in Syria. And there's a lot in there, just talking about the general outlook of Syrian and Jaziran warfare. I also made a video for the historical regional military series that encompasses the area. Recently I made one about Islamic Anatolia during the same period, which, also considering this being the cradle of the Ottoman Sultanate, was heavily influenced by the Mamluk military, was the most advanced. So we witness definitely a cavalry prevalence, but also some sort of core strength of infantry, also artillery, that is not to be found in the same ways against, deployed, for example, by the Mongols of the Ilkhanate, etc. There is the sense that the Mamluks, while being less agile, less, let's say, horse archery based than the Mongols, were actually stronger in at least in the specific theaters they came to fight against the latter, because they were sort of heavier. They were the product of a society like the one that they had grafted as slave soldiers, but de facto masters in terms of political and military power. There was much more, in fact, as we were saying, sort of Western looking, but a bit more Mediterranean, urban, right? Whereas when you start looking at Iraq, the Jazeera, and of course the more north and east you go, you see that there is a strong, more markedly Turco-Mongolian sort of outlook, more more horse archery, less infantry, and that's a trend again you can see just during the Middle Ages. If you look at the Fatimids and the Abbasids, and the Ayyubids and the Seljuks, right? You will notice that Egypt has this sort of more stable and even probably organically permanent, right, outlook compared to certain military structures within the kingdom. This, if I'm not wrong, I made a video about the Mamluk army organization during this time. It may have been, in fact, a very old one. Today we just look at tactics, but it's important to keep that sort of background in mind. All right. So, of course, today we do not even explain how the Mamluk army worked, other than probably the tactics that they performed on the battlefield. And yes, of course, there's going to be some note about the general situation, but mostly, right, it's about how they fought. So there is a military manual dating around 1400 that describes the Mamluk army still drawn up in the old Al-khamis, also known as 5 formation. That is this, in fact, 5-division array that comprised a center, 2 wings, a vanguard, and a rear guard. Right. So very simple system that sort of an in-depth, like 3 battle lines with an important role played by the main battle being the central one in terms of the core of manpower, and this capacity of the wings to hopefully envelope the enemy flanks, but mostly in fact fighting symmetrically, because the enemies that these people confronted, and just also because of the general nature of the wings when compared especially to the center, would make them more or less confined within that the tactical dynamic. What is interesting is that, as you know, battle lines in this period overall were in pretty much everywhere in depth. Right? It is true that in the West, actually, with the happening of the battle lines, introduction of artillery, also in part the reduction in size of armies, but their eventual regrowth towards especially the 15th century and on heavier bases, you have something less in depth than before. I mean, the rising importance of infantry, especially in the 15th century, has changed the way normally Western armies go at war. In the 13th century, you have the full dominance of cavalry on the battlefields, and the 3 lines in depth had become pretty much standard. We will talk briefly about you see the Battle of Ain Jalut is just before today's timeline, but we will observe how certain also outflanking tactics, like the ones that were very favored by our cavalry in the West, etc., were carried out also in the East, and there is a debate about that regarding the mutual sort of exchange of this tactical insight. But the point I was making is that Western cavalry was notoriously heavier than, and just the battle lines sort of heavier in general than the ones that the Muslims normally would field. Right, we've seen it during the Crusades. The Turks essentially had this ultra heavy, but also very elite, also numerically reduced, quantitatively heavy cavalry, and then basically just loads of horse archers without too much segmentation in between. It does sound stereotypical, but if you look at Crusade battles, it's mostly like this. The Egyptians, on the contrary, as we were saying before, had sort of more infantry. And even after the rise of the Mamluks, and this sort of even before this, more cavalry-based by background, like dynasties, you have an increase of that kind of equestrian dimension. The Mamluks definitely have also very heavy cavalry at this point, but overall, right, they do follow the pattern of the Eastern sort of. Yes, there is heavy cavalry, but mostly like it's light cavalry in the sense of really missile troops that by definition are in that sense light because they cannot hold the ground against the heavies, and they have a specific tactical function. In the West, we do not have this. Like we have, first of all, more infantry in general, but cavalry is fundamentally all or mostly heavy, and also the missile one is more like some sort of minority addition, right, to the core of the man-at-arms that constitute the main battle line, and thus the force. In that sense, they're still missile, hence light troops, but they're numerically reduced. I say this because, as we've seen typically, for example, in a battle of the 13th century, such as the one of Pelagonia, that included, in that case, also some Byzantine element that was lighter along that pattern that the East in general follows. Let's say that the most manageable way of fighting was the 3 battle line. Yeah, it's in depth, just like the Mamluks would do, but with more heavies on the flanks, and especially because of the presence of infantry. Maybe Pelagonia again is not the best example because there were lots of horse archers from the Byzantine side. Let's say if you look at from the Epirot Latin side, you see definitely sort of a heavier array, right? That functions thus in a sort of different way compared to these Eastern armies, because again, having lighter wings. Again, not always. We don't have to imagine these wings in the Mamluk array as just missiles, right? But tendentially being so. And the former entailed just a smash into frontally everything. The say the arrays like the one described again by for the Mamluks at the beginning of the 15th century, being still a bit more sort of maneuverable. Right, not again, like as we were saying before, not because the lighter means better actually, but because just their interaction is also mostly cavalry-based armies. Also, in this decentralization, like you see the fact that exists these wings and they're not like in the West infantry, but like cavalry mostly, allows you to do certain things, right, in terms of outflanking, enveloping, and so on. But it's also let's say, more dependent on not much of a gradual effort. This is what happens, I think, pretty clearly in the battles that eventually we will in part see today during the 14th to 15th century, that the Mamluks do not quite count too much on this frontal attack of the center that in fact is just split into 3, if you want, right, into wings, whereas, say, in the West, the wings were to mostly just support the heavy cavalry that has to smash through, and they were to take each other out as infantry to fall on the enemy flanks if possible, in a way that was sort of much more orderly, because the cavalry was a bit heavier, the infantry too wasn't such a great movement. In a Mamluk array, instead, you see also against lighter enemies like the Mongols, this sort of throw everything for all, like the vanguard having, of course, that preparatory softening up function of sort, and then you have the second line with 3 divisions that you have to throw in, and this acts not as a battle line, but as 3 battle lines, say one next to the other on the side. And very often, like, one section breaks, the other not. Like we will see, there are different things that can happen. There is hardly much of a coordination. In some cases, the center can support one of the wings if things go wrong. This is something you find, I would say, more rarely in Western warfare, because everything is much more funneled into the center. Like, it's not like if you break into the center, you have achieved in terms of these reserves of gradually forward sending these lines in, especially the second line, a bit like, of course, in the Mongol case, that there are, as you understand, some overlapping dynamics. A great deal in terms of the economy of the battle. The fact that instead the wings in the Mamluk armies are more mobile makes them not necessarily actually more, let's say, interacting with one another. They're technically not even wings, they're divisions on their own. They have a honor, per se, right? They, of course, are less important than the center, where usually the commander was, but they are, for example, composed of regiments of certain, I don't know, ethnic mercenaries / slaves, etc. So they act as if, I don't know, on a Western battlefield, you saw, instead of the infantry wings that have an auxiliary function, like another section of the line, but that develops in this sense in width, not in depth, right? So this is done, why? Because where the difference is, because in fact, on average, the Mamluk troops are lighter, right? So as it happens also with the Ottomans, with the Mongols, if we look at the tactics they employed, often successfully against Western armies, the fact that they would, for example, refuse the center, withdraw, is not, aside from the ultimate victory, it's not really a proof of superiority. Like, if you can't, I mean, this is a strategical principle. If you're the stronger side, you will essentially punch the enemy in the face, right, and knock them out, right? Instead, this entire thing of withdrawing the center and essentially losing it, or at least risking it, because even if you carry out a feigned flight, it's not that technically you're doing it here for just maintaining an order. I mean, the disorder in the withdrawal is something that is going to make you lose cohesion. It's something that, albeit not a route, albeit pre-planned, may actually take the form, in fact, of something way more disorderly quickly, right? So the entire coordination with the wings to fall on the enemy flanks, etc., that's clever, right? That's something that I think also in historiographically we should study much better, because we do not know, for example, in 13th century warfare, say Westerners versus Mongols, what infantry was actually doing. In fact, we do not know it even for the Mamluks here at the end of the day. Like, we see that there is infantry, we see that it does perform certain tactical roles, but we do not have like the clear pattern of where infantry was in all this, because we know it was there, but it probably had also in this case such an auxiliary role, and one evidently not making much of the various divisions, even that we do not even know, how they would have coped with the entire situation. I mean, the strength ratios, how many of these people were how relevant they were in the balance of battle. And again, Mamluk armies are fundamentally just about cavalry, right? So as this would be interesting to study and appreciate, studying the entirety of Mamluk warfare, that I don't think it's ever been done in a thorough sense, like meaning studying every single damn source existing. Doesn't matter how few there are, likely, in order to, again, reconstruct tactics successfully. Like, by now in the 14th and 15th century West, we have like an infinity of them that a single scholar, like in a lifetime, cannot cover, right? But again, Islamic sources are slightly different. They write with different purposes in mind, including like not caring for that actual battle analysis the way, in a more critical way that the West did. There are exaggerations, even some sort of Byzantinisms as far as the Atlantic fixation for proportions and square and say geometrical patterns, square numbers. I mean, and let's say all things that had been in part inherited by the Arabs throughout, in fact, the Byzantine legacy in those lands. But this is something that we cannot investigate in this video per se. It's just what, having studied some Crusades battles from the actual sources, primary sources, you realize being quite out there in the Islamic world, right? And the Western Chronicle is telling you a story, right? As even relatively, say, careless about probably the purpose of reconstructing the entire battle in a in a rationalizing fashion. I mean, that there are actually quite plausible accounts in many ways, but they do not care about drawing the entire array for you to understand what exactly happened in a battle. But the Islamic sources are just like, they met, they fought, and this guy won and this other lost. Like, they don't literally tell you like much about the array or whatever, right? So we have these manuals that contain informations regarding these arrays that can be a bit theoretical. But the Al-khamis one, the 5 division formation, is after all quite realistic. It does make sense. We know it for some of the major battles, right? So it is accurate, right? And we can be safe. The Mamluks would mostly fight like this. Regarding the subunits, it's a bit different. As I said before, even infantry is sort of unknown in this array position. There is also this idea that the Mamluks prefer to draw up with their backs protected by some obstacle like a river or high ground, which naturally makes you think, but what about if they had to retreat? Good point, right? In fact, I doubt this would be the normality. It's better, like, actually to have a flank protected in some way, and even in that case, like, this is typical in Western warfare, even with flank attacks that, as we will see now, being quite frequent among the Mamluks. You can't hide a guy in the, on the side, like there is a hill range with some valleys that come out perpendicularly to the flank of the enemy, like to the direction of the struggle, the vectors of advance during the engagement. So these words are drawn from just broader sayings, right? If you have a high ground in the rear and you can, for example, have, some reserve up there, that's another thing. That's part of the battlefield, right? A river may be something else. But apparently the Mamluks did care about protecting their rear, and they also would dig ditches and especially deploy some reserves even behind the entire array, as we will see now, which a measure which in that case was mostly functional to support some ambush parties that were stationed on the flanks, and so mostly behind the array, not because of necessarily the fear of a rear attack, which is something rare, given that it's, for questions of military logic, it's a bit unlikely that an enemy party is able to emerge from the rear of your formation out of nothing, rather the flanks, right, and being able to symmetrically move either right or left. All right. The army commander, as we were saying before, was located in the center. Particular precautions for the positioning of the army in general was trying to get the sun and the wind behind, because especially in the Levant, as you understand, the wind could wipe out clouds of sand or dust into the soldiers' faces. There can be some severe tactical disadvantage at this point. We know that cavalry could dismount, even renouncing essentially to carry out their charge, because if the wind should turn out to be blowing against their own army, the horses' demand would have become incapable of properly maintaining an effective order that, as you know, is vital during a cavalry charge. And this by a people that knew how to ride like hell, right? Like the Mamluks. So, an excellent chivalric, like equestrian culture, which had not much to learn about cavalry warfare by anyone, managing to beat even the Mongols at some point. So This tells you, yes, again, also environmentally speaking, like the likelihood that just a dust storm, a sandstorm would just compromise the entire order of the battle is maybe an exaggeration, but definitely there are some weather conditions in the Levant that can't produce that among the various things. And the alternative to the cavalry charge was actually to dismount their cavalry and to fight on foot, rather than disordering the cavalry charge. This is interesting because, after all, what we see, these are the centuries of the 100 Years' War, right? So you do see, I don't know, the English typically dismounting a lot their men-at-arms, right? The notion is that the English would have fought like that anyway, but that's not actually the case. Mostly in the most famous battles of the 100 Years' War is because they were drastically outnumbered. And so they decided to gain an advantage at defense, right, in particular positions, and dismounted to carry that out, because cavalry cannot defend by definition unless it dismounts and becomes infantry. So there are similar instances, like we've seen it even in Mongol warfare. Made some videos about, for example, the Mongol horse, the fact that the Mongols themselves fighting against each other, because these tactics occurred pretty much, in fact, in Central Asia as well, but also against the Mamluks, went under a so-called arrows shower, which was extremely typical of these armies. They would at some point dismount from their horses and using the same animal as a living barricade, like living for not too long unitly, but in particular situations this was done as well. Not typically, like the major pitch battle was, okay, everybody on horseback trying to use, as we were saying at the beginning, sort of carefully proportionate way, trying to break the enemy line, right, and or trying to fall on the enemy flanks in some way, etc. That was naturally the sort of more functionally preferable way to fight like that. The point is that when you have lighter troops in general, these do not really maintain much of an array, right? They're going to stay, of course, in the proximity of what's their initial deployment, like the core of the unit is, but things could get pretty disordered fast. It's not like maintaining alignment for just ultra heavy cavalry that really maintains alignment just by training, and by also in part the fact that they can't literally move more than much away from one another, and they're just very slow in the way they advance. The cavalry of the Mamluk vanguard were elite troops, right? They were selected from those that had displayed particular strength and courage, conquering spirit, experience in wars, the source says. This is also typical not just of the Mamluks, but also Western warfare. You see it pretty much everywhere. Like, vanguards are normally path openers of some sort. They have a quasi-suicidal mission, and they are the best division in which to display the greatest feats of heroism. This was especially sought after by the youth, like those warriors who had yet to be made, and that had thus to show, like, having this actually place of honor, like being the least, the most courageous, right, and thus also sort of setting the beginning, like, of the battle as such. And this array stemmed from some general step precaution. Like in the West, what you have, rather than simply a first line, it's like really suicidal troops that have to smash into the enemy lines and getting out of there either dead or captive unless the rest of the army won, right? And so it had developed from, now I can't digress on specifically the Western art of war, but on this sort of more diamond shape, like hand that had to again pierce through the enemy formation for real, like entirely. This array here among the Mamluks is instead some sort of safety measure of the steppe that was used to since there was again a lot of missile warfare involved, like sort of testing the enemy, not getting the best immediately into combat. Again, it's just like a different degree compared to the same Western warfare, and it could not be about necessarily this kind of smashing into the enemy line. Also because consider enemies like the Mongols, in fact, they would have maybe refused the center. The Mamluk cavalrymen were able at different times charging straight against heavier enemies, also the Western ones. But it's obvious again that mostly fighting against these Middle Eastern foes, they would have mostly used this first division as screening or something, even when they were actually in proportion heavier than the enemy. Alright, again, Egypt had a sort of kind of heavier based, more Statal-like, more territorialized army with a bureaucracy behind. So tendentially they were heavier troops as well. They were more settled, right? Aside from the ethnic origin of the Mamluks, they were sort of, they would in fact gentrify, like one of the reasons why they succumbed to the Ottomans ideally is also the sort of crisis that this bureaucratic state underwent towards the later Middle Ages, always remaining, firm the concept that these powers here are not that strongly Statal, like in fact the Western ones that in fact field heavier troops really are, right? The Mamluks are, for example, involved into never-ending civil wars. There is this typical Islamic instability. The system militarily was fueled by the continuous injection of these slaves from far away as Caucasus or Central Asia that were just the next guys who had to fight in order to be settled down and then to sort of privatize and whatever. It's again, I talk about the Mamluk army organization. There were different regiments. It was pretty, that in part would have lasted for generations and would have been dissolved. It's very complex, right? So it's not that uniform as one may think. And consequently, what these armies look like reflect a bit the sort of scrapped together forces from whoever was able out there to send certain amount of troops, and often also with lighter elements that were just auxiliary function, but making also substantially large number, so rendering these armies a bit necessarily lighter and less smashing, right, in the individual parts, even though again they were a force to be reckoned with, even as far as the tactical function was concerned. Now, the same vanguard, the same frontal division could be subdivided, like the second line, into center, left, and right. This is also kind of normal, right? Even in the West, you do have maybe little wings next to these sort of breakers. In the Mamluk army, however, this seemingly was part of a more officialized sort of, unit distinction. Again, in the West, if you're an infantryman, a commoner in that regard, you're not going to be ranked as a unit yourself, because it's the men-at-arms that dominate, right? And that therefore does not distinguish between a unit on the wings, like in a formal sense, right? Those are just the guys who fight alongside the heavies in the center. And this wings in the Mamluk army were often being referred as the two advance guards or the two wings, right? Surely these were also subordinated soldiers compared to the center, but they still had this honor on their own. All three bodies may have even be further subdivided so that the whole vanguard may have actually comprised 9 individual squadrons, known as Kardis. Now, normally the vanguards were smaller than the center, so one can simply do the math and saying, I don't know, an army of 30,000 men would simply make in this Kardis, I don't know, 666 men, just to be very mathematically squared, right? But it gives the latter number gives you sort of the dimension of this cavalry force of even a few or even some hundreds, which it's not really too few, right? We may be exaggerating here, like how, of course, important, like even just the equestrian status was even for lighter troops within the Mamluk system for the Mamluks themselves, right? Not to consider the horse archer just like a sort of, scum of the earth aggregate, say, just put together from somewhere else. We also know too few about the actual composition of these units, but it's relevant that they were ranked in this way, and so that they surely had an importance connected to that sort of lighter dimension of the army that sort of gave more importance to the same light element after all, in a more homogeneous fashion. Speaking of the center, where the army standards, together with the commanders, were invariably stationed, there could be a similar subdivision. In other words, as we were saying before, you have a central division in the second line that can have its own wings. Again, this is something you don't find in the West, because the single battle line in the West is just the heavies, the men-at-arms essentially, and the infantry on the wings, right? Or even maybe lighter troops, yes, whatever, in a sense of missile. But you do not find, like, as we were saying before, like a central division and then 2 side divisions, if not in the sense that they were, as it normally happens, there are subdivisions of the same entire unit. Here instead, these units are evidently separated. You have a central division and then not the wings of the division. Yes, they are, because they are weaker than the center, but they are some divisions in their own regard, and each of these 3 divisions in the second line has its own wings. All right. This again happens also because proportionally there is less heavy cavalry than light ones, so it was sort of also more convenient or unavoidable to intersperse this lighter troops, creating, for example, wings. But it also and mostly shows in between. It shows that these divisions operated in a tactically autonomous way, meaning that each of them was a sort of mini army with, again, the heavies in the center and some lighter forces in the wings to carry out specific tactics in battle, right? This is extremely relevant. This still shows how the Mamluks were likely heavier than, say, their other Turco-Mongol opponents, because especially steppes peoples tended to, this could happen actually in some steppes peoples, but there was a much greater prevalence there of horse archers that were often gathered just as broader masses in within the broader array. Likely the Mamluks had some sort of heavier deal, and so they would try to enact not just simply arrow showers but actual combined arms tactics from within the same divisions on the enemy. This again also the Mongols did to an extent. It's not so strange, but the proportions were surely like with a heavier Mamluk face, right? It's a bit like the Ottomans when they fight against the Safavids, right? The Ottomans are sort of much more Western looking at that point. The Battle of Caldeirante. And they crash the Safavid army was sort of more feudal and say Mongol looking, right? The Mamluks again are instead a bit more similar to the Ottomans since the beginning because of the resources, the type of state they have established in the Mediterranean. The Mamluks are told by the very famous Arab sociologist, philosopher, and historian Ibn Khaldun, right, widely acknowledged as to be one of the greatest social scientists of the Middle Ages. We're talking 1332, 1406. The fighting in line in close formation, right? Ibn Khaldun was very much a supporter of the closed order, so likely this reference to the Mamluks as these guys fighting some heavier array than many other Muslim armies would otherwise. Then this closed order was naturally functional to some sort of shock charge, right? Probably the heavy cavalry. Otherwise, there were other type of formations. These are documented from the Nihayat al-Sul, Book of Tactics and Military Training, which shows different types, in fact, of formations, right? Different shapes. This could be relatively ideal, right? This is a bit like for, I don't know, the Roman army we get, especially from the Hellenic manuals, like this sense of, oh, look, there are all these forms you can, the shapes you can form with the units. We talked about it, actually, talking about the Dutch drill recently during the 80 Years' War, and so this idea that, yes, the soldiers could be trained to form different formations, shapes, but how effective would these be? So if it is just an exercise and something that you would do in a circus to entertain the local population, it's something. In battle, it may be something else. We know definitely that the Mamluks had quite intense training on horseback. There were quite frequent parade, like chances of properly verifying the effectiveness of the troops, their capacity to perform the drill, etc. So one shape of this formation was the hilali, which is the crescent shape, and it's sort of like towards like with the horns towards the enemy, all right? The ends toward the enemy. Then the opposite of this would be the muyanna, which would be attacking the enemy, but with the convex part of the crescent towards the enemy. Then you would have there were others. For example, the kurach, that was probably the circle, which I imagine not having any other function but doing something like the contemporary gallop, right? Which would have been sort of normal, just having this circle that in the moment in which the horseman arrives to the part that is closer to the enemy, shoots and then reloads and passes by again. Then you would have the murabba, that, as far as I understand, would be sort of a rectangular formation, albeit it was the mustatil, which also means a rectangle, but should have been mostly about sort of a wedge-shaped formation. So a rhomboid one like, I don't know, some Hellenistic cavalries were used to perform. So a rhomboid shape, or even a half triangular one derived from it. There were different types also moving from one to the other, and again, this is not so too relevant overall as I was saying before, in the for our understanding of how these guys would fight, also because actually how you fight in battle formation is not a matter of particular special forms and shapes or whatever. Like, you're an army, more or less. All these armies fight in the same way, right? But again, in terms of training, these shapes were relevant because they were supposed to be performed just even as exercises for keeping the troops fit, and in some cases they would have their purpose. And the fact that there is this hint to the sort of the wedge, the crescent, etc., of course, it lets us think that much of these tactics were for horse archery, right? Or for changing, for example, the rhomboid one also in antiquity was used to change, to advance with the wedge towards the enemy. So at some point, changing fast for some reason the direction of the charge, because you could wheel about just 45 degrees from one side or the other and just already being in formation for that. But especially for like sort of trying to envelope the enemy with horse archers and having a strong center, sort of thinner wings that could try to in fact extend and outflank the enemy. The crescent shape is kind of cool, because if you get in between, you try to charge them. These guys they can fire at you from the sides, and they have more archers in the center, in a thicker line. So it's just where you do not want to be, and so you can keep at bay, maybe have your opponents by sort of temporarily unnerving them like that. Also because the heavies hardly would charge into these horse archers. Very often it could be again a ruse, as we will learn now, an ambush of some sort, and just wasting the heavies against the lights is sort of bad, right? But you could find this kind of harassing situations. Now, ambushes were particularly important in this kind of warfare for the aforementioned reasons of greater mobility and flexibility of the army overall. The fact that being there not much mass to oppose to, say, I don't know, the Mamluks did not fight too frequently against the Westerners, but say it would happen, right? They would opt naturally a bit more to this for these feigned flights, ambushes, flank attacks, whatever. This was carried out, of course, also against the same, more similar opponents, like the Mongols. And the idea always stems again from the more diluted amount of missile that you can find here, and so you don't really want to charge with a structure that is not that heavy after all, and that can be better used by prolonging the struggle and shooting the enemy at distance, and if anything trying to outflank him gradually with these maneuvers, while the forces are wearing out one another, right? This is very typical of the Turks. It's a steppes heritage, and we will talk more about these peoples, but again, consider that the Mamluks are a bit heavier in this regard too. There is an early 14th century military manual from Damascus by Muhammad ibn Isa, stating that units placed in ambush could, and indeed they should, comprise a third or even 2/3 of the army's strength. Now, this is not really necessarily like a Mamluk thing. This is more just like a general principle of the art of war. The reserves you can use are just, depending on, like, of course, I made a video about the ambush, right? And of course, it would be cool to pin the enemy down with just a very small force and having all the bigger one not being spotted by the enemy and falling on his rear flanks like that. But say this is unlikely to happen in the first place. It's not about the Mamluk war. So here it's just like a prescription, right? Of course, the most resolutive attack from the flank comes as you literally have. There are battles that were really turning out to be like this, an enemy army popping up from a direction that was unexpected and so asymmetric compared to the enemy, and so the battle was practically not even fought at that point, because the surprise army was sort of melted away. This is not something you can immediately decide that easily. Actually, let's say that the ambush parties would be regularly smaller. There is a tendency, however, as we've seen in this warfare, to greater flexibility, to also a less capacity of punching force, especially against, in fact, other lighter troops, meaning that, say, in Western warfare, for example, to take out like a battle line of 1,000 men-at-arms, you could have even just 60 men-at-arms thrown disorderly from a hidden position on the flank on these guys, well, not necessarily disorderly, but just that few, right, and speedily, and catching the moment more than else. On the enemy flank, cutting, destroying, basically. Naturally, when the enemy battle line was engaged against your own, right, so that's how it works normal. But there we're talking about normally all heavy cavalry, like it's the case in the West. In a context like this, where you have most of the enemy battle lines composed by, especially think of the Mongols, the Turks, from the Middle East in general, with lots of horse archers. Well, also the capacity of the flank attack, right? The surprise, the possibility, for example, of the enemy cavalry to pull out is without caring about maintaining formation, because they're horse archers, they don't maintain it anyway. Yes, it can, it can't truly, like, coming from the flank, the attack is going to be psychologically devastating, but it's not going to be so geometrically punching like in the West, right, where those heavies can't properly even disengage that easily. Again, let's not pretend like in fact it wasn't heavy cavalry in which the effect would be that high, right? I'm just talking because, yes, the Mamluks would fight a lot of wars against each other, and so they were symmetrical in that regard, but also against all these foes who were sort of relatively lighter. So these are just prescriptions, such as the fact that the reserve should not be positioned more than 1 mile in a fort, which makes sense because essentially just a couple of kilometers away you can't quite grasp what's going on. This was another problem of medieval armies, which revolved around, in fact, mostly the danger of an ambush party hidden somewhere. Like normally, pitched battles were fought in pretty open areas, but they could also stretch for a very long distance, and times multiple kilometers. If you look at the Battle of Manzikert, for example, you wouldn't know what was ahead, right? And there were some moments in which you had no idea necessarily even of how many battle lines the enemy had out there, and some could be concealed. This is even more likely for the East, where again these tactics have been practiced due to, again, this greater, let's call it maneuverability of the single units that are, because they're lighter. Equally, however, they are also, as we've seen, less likely to be successful. At least they have to be able to intervene quickly, right? There is like this distance, right, tells us that the ambush party was something bigger that had to maneuver a bit more, in fact, even to come into play. Very different from the West, in which the ambush party had to be literally, it's a bit small, literally hidden somewhere close, right, the battlefield, so that they could charge quickly, like in a few minutes at most, in smashing into the enemy flank, right? Unless it was like an entirely hidden reserve. That's why, for example, the Battle of Ain Yalut is so relevant, because it was fought in 1260. As you know, the Mongols were crushed at that battle, right? And the only 8 years later, you have the Battle of Tagliacozzo in 1268, in which the Angevins, because apparently of the advice of the Templar Allard de Valery, that had served in the Near East during the Crusades, would perform a similar tactics, which is not, again, the usual one of the concealed little pocket of knights, but an entire battle line. in my opinion, this has absolutely nothing to do with, let's say, specifically like the Mamluks, and or simply like the entirety of, say, the opportunity that could make that battle line hidden in the battle. It had to do also with the nature of the territory of Tagliacozzo. That is sort of mountainous. It's different valleys. It's you know, it sort of allows a bit that tactics. What happens also is really is common in the rest of Western warfare as well, as we're just saying, like because of the distance of some, I don't know, trees or whatever could not make you see clearly what was out there, hopefully some hills, whatever. You could have an entire battle line that you had no idea was coming. For example, there are battles in which the enemy, like this one, you defeat with your battle line and hunt down the broken enemy. And you start looting, right? You start stripping the dead of their armor. There is sometimes also you sack the camp. Well, if at this point there is a hidden reserve out there somewhere, you can fall on these guys and killing them all, because they were all sort of scattered. And at Tagliacozzo you even have these forces caught by surprise, managing to rally and to put up a struggle emergentially. So we'll talk about that battle because it's one of the single most important in medieval warfare, but in general also for the consequences in world history. And even though there is this idea that Charles of Anjou had been advised by, again, this guy who had been in the Crusades, may have learned the stuff from the Easterners, this was something that had already happened and would keep happening without the sort of advice, together with the flank attack, which was something that from the early 13th century is well documented for Europe, so well before these times, even with entire battle lines. Think about the Battle of Muret. And that surely was not even the first meeting. That is just getting better documented and detailed from the sources, right? Not because anybody had to really learn like a basic principle of the art of war. So there is a lot of mythology around this. The idea that the Westerners copy this, tactics from these. These are basic strategic principles, right? What is fascinating, if anything, is to look at how, let's say, these tactics were systemically carried out depending on the different peoples that did this. And again, with the Mamluks, I already explained you what the main differences are with the West, and even with their eastern opponent. As we will see now, by the way, the Battle of Ain Jalut is sort of atypical, because the guys who actually chased down from the flank the broken Mongol cavalry are actually infantry, just to tell you how actually, like, but cavalry is faster, whatever. No, right? There are moral forces involved. After one enemy is broken, you can chase him down, and yes, typically cavalry can get out of the way more quickly. But sometimes they're stunned and they can't get themselves captured and killed, like in this case, right? So the instructions that we were reading, however, here about the distance of the ambush parties from the... and by the way, as you understand, this makes actually the Battle of Tagliacozzo something much more advanced and sort of well laid out with the same Western cavalry. So it was probably a concealed party rather than, as we will see now, a type of unit was normally deployed on the flank, also as part of the division. But we will have to talk a bit more in depth about the Battle of Ain Jalut in a dedicated video, just as for Tagliacozzo, that in my opinion again are two very different battles also as far as the flank attack goes. So again, I doubt they have much to do with one another, consequentially, causally, right? But going back to this advice, right, of one miles and 1/4 of distance with the ambush party from the main army. This ambush party, the sources, the source says, right, this military manual by the early 14th century Damascene author Muhammad Isa, says that the ambush party itself must be divided up into 3. Right, so similar to the divisions that we have seen, so hardly like some concealed party, but an entire division practically, or something similar to it. These had to be positioned, but they had to be multiple chunks. So again, they were not to stay together, but this is more what you see in the West. In the West, you see just one hidden party on the flank, right? And that's it, right? Here instead you have these 3 ones positioned, one each to the left and the right of the enemy. And the third one drawn behind the main army, as we were saying before. So basically you have a symmetrical plan, which, as you understand, if the enemy did in the same way, would have created a sort of symmetry. In fact, I studied flank attacks in my research, and I came to the conclusion that these these concealed parties were always sort of there, and the proof of it is that the only time in which they are mentioned is when the flank attack was successful. So basically, we know of their existence only when they decided the battle, which is, impossible, right? It's not every time that this happens, because one guy had deployed that thing and the enemy not, and the action had always happened, because otherwise everybody would have always done it, right? Even though, again, the terrain was to be checked, whatever. Just it's normal for the normal battle information not to have this particular aspect highlighted if this flank existed, but it was this hidden part existed, but it did not attack. Sometimes, it does happen. I found it once, but in that case, it's also perhaps the only one I saw it named for both armies at the same time, which is something you don't hear normally in battle accounts. It's either, again, always the successful one that carries this out. But as you understand here, the thing is a bit different. It's not like in the West, one party that decisively, single-handedly takes down the enemy battle line, attacking it from the air. It's something more combined in nature, because again, also the enemy is sort of more flexible. And in fact, we see how the enemy behaves. It says this tribal position must essentially function in this way. Naturally, so if the source says actually this, it's easier said than paraphrased. If the enemy sees them to be few in number, they will seek to attack them, and when the Muslim forces routed, will give chase, and then the second group will break out upon them. Once they have gained their objective, they should return straightway to their position. Right. This is incredibly strange for someone who has studied just the western side of the story, because again, there is one asymmetric attack from one direction, the battle line is destroyed, and this is it. Here we have instead the idea that you must have essentially a reserve for this hidden reserve behind, by the way, the entire array, which is strange because this array was pretty deep. And so what could you see exactly, especially if these two advanced parties would operate, in fact, in front of the same array, because they had to get on the flank of the enemy that naturally could have not bypassed your own array in the meanwhile, unless you were destroyed. So you don't even understand how they would coordinate this thing, because even if like these movements would have been on the flanks would have been conceived properly also from your own array, depending from which they operated. Otherwise, the enemy too would have been able to see it, right? So it's strange, but especially this is not much about a direct flank attack. It's literally to purposely create a feint flight from one of the two hidden units on the flank, so that when the enemy finds out that especially this weaker one that has attacked is retreating, they have to chase it, and so your own hidden party on the other side of this will attack these guys at this point, having turned and especially broken to pursue the enemy, or having relaxed themselves after some possibly also initial combat, not necessarily like just a feint flight without contact, or a missile one, would have fallen on their rear and destroyed them, right? And this is very optimistic as well. Like, wouldn't the enemy know, generally speaking, how this thing happened? You see, in this context, you don't just surprise the enemy to win, right? To achieve immediately that asymmetry. You have to come out, reveal this threat that the enemy could have seen coming, and attract, and then carrying out a feint flight, and hopefully all this coordinated with a guy on the other side that should have been in sight, by the way, of the entire scene. So if the enemy had turned, like, from the other side, would have seen maybe the same party concealed, that it would have immediately, like, this is very idealistic, and that's why I don't think things work exactly in the same way. That at that point, that hidden parties we've seen should have attacked, and at that point only you would have achieved, hopefully, this decisive effect, at least on that section of the enemy, on the enemy line. Hopefully, here we're talking about the second, the main one, right? So the real center of the enemy. We do have, as we will see now, cases in which when, for example, one wing is broken in the array, another, like the center, is uncovered in part to come to help this, or just to sustain that part of the line on the wing. So the picture is actually one of units that are, you see, the enemy is provided even with the possibility of turning and chasing. This is something in the West you don't find, because again, the units are, say, the battle lines are so heavy that they have to smash frontally. That's also why the Mongols, the Turks at Nicopolis or Varna refuse their own center. They have to attract the Westerners into, because you can't quite stop their charge, not even by a flank attack in that way. You have to stop them first, right? So here, the idea is that definitely, like in many Eastern armies, there is this, like, all these divisions are sort of antennas that have mostly to be careful about what they do, because likely they're just aware that at every step of the way there is a freaking danger, and that this is not essentially these tactics are not even supposed to be a surprise, even assuming that they work exactly the way this is described. Surely flank attacks, feint flights, this kind of ambushes were all over the place in Eastern warfare, among, Mamluks, Mongols. It was their daily bread, right? But also because their armies were sort of more looser in the actual cohesion, in the compactness of the single battle lines. This is particularly important. In fact, these manuals overall recommend that a routed enemy should be pursued only with caution in case it should prove to be a feint flight, right? Only the flanks should pursue, while the main body should advance at a steady pace, and the flanks should never pursue beyond sight of it, which in part explains why the wings, as we've seen, are provided with such an important autonomy. They're not just some auxiliary forces like in the West that are not even counted as units on their own. They're just, the battle line technically is just the men-at-arms in the West. The commoners on foot are just, yes, militarily, tactically speaking, part of the battle line, but the sources never explicitate that. The honor of the battle line is only of the men-at-arms, the nobility. And that's the interesting side of the story. Here in the East, instead, you have something else. You have these flank divisions essentially fighting with greater autonomy on the sides, because they have to be able even to chase off these attacks, right? And in fact, the interesting thing about the aforementioned advice is how could they simply attack the enemy from the rear once they were chasing these guys if the enemy battle line was in fact typically 3 divisions wide, right? Only the division from the other side would have chased your own party from the other side. What about the others, right? So very often also these manuals are a bit ideal theoretical, because again the Arabs have inherited here a bit of that Hellenic idea of the stratagem, of the tactical module, but actually battles were much simpler in many ways. And there is an important instance of in fact documented for the Battle of Shaqhab, fought on 3 days from April the 20th to the 22nd, 1303, between the Mamluks under the Sultan An-Nasir Muhammad and the Ilkhan of Persia, Kutlug Shah, during the invasion of Syria of the same year. Right. There were different ethnic contingents. For example, the Mongols had the Georgians and the Cilician Armenians with them, that evidently were sort of, yes, closer to the Mongols, but also trying to keep the Mamluks out of their own abodes. That I made a bit about the Cilician, about both actually, and especially in the latter case, you've seen how the Cilicians resist to the Mamluks till the end, even when the cruise Aleppo has fallen, Acre has fallen, and I made a video about the siege of Acre, 1291. We are essentially here 12 years later, right? So you see the Cilicians, the Cilician Armenians hanging on, right? Trying to keep the Mamluks out by supporting the Mongols. Well, the battle, we will see what Shaqhab was about, because there are these 3 engagements in which in the first 2 days nobody really managed to get the upper hand. They would carry out this hit and run tactics. That would be instances in which this is where the Mamluks actually have their right division broken by the Mongol attack, and from the center they save the first day by moving part of the forces in the center to hold the right flank, and the center also holds, right? And the Mongols retreat, and then the following day there's again this other skirmishes. At the end of the day, basically they exhaust each other, and the main problem is that these guys that had massive amounts of horsemen, the Mongols apparently had 50,000 men, right? And so they had also been attacking with different numbers, and logistics now was quite pressing. After some days, you couldn't even stay too long in a certain place with all those horses for hygienic reasons and more. I think also about that, like the corpses from the previous days of combat. But it's about water, right? And on the 3rd and last day, the battle concentrates on along a stream, where the Mongols that are sort of the more tired in this sense go drinking, and while they are literally just, they have lowered guard because either they drink or they die, the Mamluks that had another stream to their rear, so they suffered less of thirst, attacked the Mongols, and according to the sources, as they began to harvest, the Mongols had as men harvest barley from a sickle, right? This attack had been actually prepared by a feigned flight. The Mongols had, the Mamluks had fallen back, and they had allowed the Mongols to have this false impression that the Mamluks at least had been fenced off. Instead, these come back and they kill them. So that's an example, at least a feigned flight. It's a sort of ambush. In this case, with a counterattack succeeding, right? But it also doesn't show much more complicated maneuvers in this entire picture. And there were lots of different factors here. Considering we're talking tactics, that the stony terrain of Syria was a problem for the Mongol ponies, right? Because as we've seen in the video about the Mongol horse, and likely the Mamluk war horses were not shoed, right? So the Mamluks had, as you see here, a bit more of a chivalric, feudal, heavy cavalry than the Mongol ones. Mongols, yes, they are the heroes of cavalry tactics, but as you understand it, as we explained actually in the videos about Mongol warfare, it's not that they were particularly advanced as we think. They were an incredibly primitive people. And their successes as their defeats depended on this as well. So the Mamluks were a bit more like, again, having horse shoeing, different types of horses in the first place, etc. But we'll make a video about also the Mamluk horse, war horse, because it's to explain the differences and making the comparison better with the Mongol one as well. But for saying that, armies are just like a concert. It's not much about the single pieces that you have, but how good they play together, right? Speaking of infantry that we were hinting at, the military manuals of the time do provide details about the role of the foot in Mamluk armies, right? They are not to be found so much for battle accounts. In the chronicles, the mention of infantry is quite rare. This is something which actually until the 14th century, the end of the 13th century, is the case even for some of the largest battles in Western Europe, such as the aforementioned Tagliacozzo, but also Benevent or Markfeld, right? We know that there were lots of infantrymen, but regarding their role in combat, we practically know nothing, because the chronicles are just too, very often in this case, is from a bit like the feudal background, or at least people that were depending on the courts, so in a context that did not care about the infantry element as much as, say, a communal one could do, right? And that's only later that we get news of these. But in 14th, 15th century Mamluk historiography, you do not see, in fact, much infantry mentions either. So again, cavalry was prevalent, right, decisive, probably at the beginning of the period, and it overshadowed, of course, the role of infantry. That, however, was there. The apparent use that, in my opinion, could be also here a bit ideal, but in Mamluk tactics, as much as actually even in some other Turk and Mongolian context, was to place the foot on the defensive left flank, right? One of the reasons was that apparently the best cavalry was on the right flank. There was an asymmetry, right? But I suspect that the sources stating this are maybe, if not, say, just copying some ancient Hellenic models. Notoriously, the phalanx was not, like, say, the best men were on the right. They were perhaps overstating a bit, like the general value of this. It depended on, like, yes, we've seen it also in the Ottoman army, that usually the forces, there were all some places of honor. The right was definitely the most important one, but sometimes these were also politically determined, not necessarily just always like the right would be the reason why I say it is that, generally speaking, these types of armies in the Middle Ages come from military backgrounds that are pretty warlike in the first place. They don't, as we've seen, that they have a lot of autonomy on their own, and they do tend to be symmetrical. Like the deployment is apparently symmetrical. So the news of this infantry place on the left flank, especially, perplexes me. But again, we should look. I mean, I don't think it's wrong. Like for the battle on Ain Yalut, this seemingly was the case. But we have to understand also where this infantry was in a better sense. Meaning, why would a cavalry-based army need to concentrate the infantry on the left simply because the right would be the best, and cavalry would have to be placed just there? I mean, couldn't infantry be part of all divisions, for example, behind the cavalry? All right. I don't think that it makes too much sense. It's a problem we have also in the West, where everything is symmetric and infantry is on both sides. You don't find this kind of story. It is true that with horse archery, especially, like you shoot on, normally tendentially on with greater ease towards the left. So if you have the best cavalry, the best horse archers on the right, you can, generally speaking, hit the enemy more effectively, even though they're going to have the shield from that side. So this really depends in many ways, and it must be seen. In my opinion, there was an important degree of symmetry. All right, but that may have been, however, a way to place infantry also in other, say, for example, the Ilkhanate army or whatever. Given, however, that this infantry was not particularly performing in these battles, even though at Ain Jalut, as we were saying before, it's actually the Mamluk infantry that chases the broken Mongol cavalry, yes, on a hill, and they cut them down. Just for saying again how things depend mostly on moral force and not even whether you're mounted or not. In that case, the fact that the Mongol cavalry was already broken in the first place was sort of a child's play in many ways. One general role, however, of infantry in the broader tactical function that is described was to hold the enemy back until their own cavalry were mounted and drawn up. In other words, some sort of screen. Except we have no idea how this happened. Well, we find all these, let's say, ideas, especially during the Crusades, and also for Western armies, that infantry was deployed in a particular way. Surely they acted in tandem with cavalry, and there was, especially in the East, this need of countering the enemy archery. Right, so actually we do find this specific array, like a line formed with the infantrymen going down on one knee with their shields to the fore and the spears held out from the upper part of the chest, while the archers were to shoot literally into the enemy's faces, right? And we have the historian Al-Maqrizi from Cairo, living between 1364 and 1442, telling us that in a battle 1354, the Mamluk infantry stood in front of the infantry of the Mamluks, say better, stood in front of the cavalry with large shields to intercept the missiles, right? And the cavalry stood behind them in safety with their weapons ready. You were not even told, for example, whether the archers were in front or behind the heavy infantry, because technically, like in a skirmishing role, they could have even in looser formation gone back and forth and simply retreated to the ranks of the same heavy infantry. It's really normal. Like with open formation, loose formation, you can actually do what you can. Retreat into the gaps between the various subunits, because you don't have a formation yourself, nothing happens really. But we do not know how it worked. It's likely also that we don't actually know how, even in the West, the missiles really operated. Like, the most likely idea is that they actually shot over the heads of the heavy infantry in front of them rather than the other way around. But we also know that the archers advanced, for example, together with the heavy infantry, where the wings closed on the enemy cavalry when the enemy wings were taken out. But again, in this context, we do not know, especially in which terms they operated with the cavalry that was stationed, as we've seen in every division, on the flanks, right? So here we have the infantry screening, cavalry, even with large shields that could... I wouldn't know what kind of shields they were, by the way. As you know, there is this idea in the late Middle Ages that the pavises were born just as this huge camping tables moved by one guy. It could have not even been, especially in siege warfare in that case, but people think that this happened also in pitched battles. It's a bit more complex than that. But in order to protect the horse, at least of course the horse would have been tall as much as a guy. Maybe the shields were really big, they could screen the horse. But the idea, however, is because the horsemen were cuirassed, whereas the horses themselves rarely were. This was absolutely normal also in the West, that was the case. But think, in fact, how many single arrows were thrown, like on these battlefields. I mean, you can make the calculations for the Mongol armies. I made a video about the Mongol logistics for the invasion of Syria. In fact, in this anti-Mamluk context, we can think something between 600,000 and 1 million arrows being shot in a single battle, so something insane. These arrows actually individually were not as terrible as a crossbow bolt from the West, but the West had also less crossbowmen and less missile in comparison, so it was balanced even when these armies fought against one another at some point. Now, the reason why I say this again is that the idea of infantry screening cavalry makes sense only if you think that cavalry has a loose formation. And so we're talking about horse archers or other kind of light cavalry, right? Because having heavy cavalrymen with heavy infantry behind is sort of suicidal. That's why actually, like, there were this kind of arrays, but only when these forces were distanced enough, right? In terms of close cooperation with one another, like this, again, we have to see still all the 11th, 12th century Western warfare to explain how this worked also in there. But by the 13th to 14th century, we're talking about very advanced combined arms tactics that were fully integrating the various arms. And there is an instance, for example, of the Mamluk one of the Mamluk invasions of Cyprus, where actually the Christian army suffered of this problem. Like, they were pushed back, the cavalry was pushed back by the Mamluks, and they invested the infantry with nefarious consequences. That's why infantry would have preferably remained on the flanks, so that they would have left a corridor in between for cavalry to flee, and they could have dispersed also out of this channel where the enemy cavalry would have simply advanced without dispersing necessarily too much. But here we're talking about, as we've seen in Mamluk armies, a lot of lighter cavalry. So if the sense is that you use your horse archers on the wings and the infantry is behind, or yes, your infantry is behind, right? You can make this lights retreating behind the infantry. Another option is the infantry is actually in the front, and it would be if you make the cavalry retreat. But the idea is that this infantry, in order to resist any meaningful attack, has to be first of all, it's heavy infantry, and it must be several ranks deep, especially if there is all this terrible firepower from the other side. So covering a guy with a shield, like an infantryman with this large shield, parrying the blows for a horseman behind, can happen only if you have a couple of soldiers, not if you have an entire line of infantry. Like that is going to be deep. It's not going to take, like, it's closer to the enemy, it may be taking more hits, but in a general sense the enemy can shoot over the same infantry and hitting the cavalry behind it cannot be covered by these infantrymen with the shields in the formation in front of the cavalry. So these are the questions that likely we will not see answered practically, because also of the aforementioned reasons, this type of info on the infantry is really scarce. And eventually with firearms things change also in the way infantry is deployed, so we don't have too much info about that in the Middle Ages, unfortunately. Also, this info that the cavalry stood behind and the infantry in safety with their weapons ready by Al-Maqrizi would be okay if, again, we're talking about a very light screen of cavalry, which may have even happened to some degree, like some shield bearers carrying this tactic out, but just all of this to parry the horses. I mean, would it have simply easier to just attack with the enemy, would counterattack the enemy with horse archers in the same way? I mean, that's how especially step tactics had been going on, and also without infantry in practice. So how the Mamluks use their infantry here is a bit of a mystery, a solved mystery, and it's completely normal for the times and the places. Like you do not hope to know normally how these things work, even just in the best documented contexts, how you can imagine these ones. Yet another Mamluk tactics was the one of arrow showering the enemy. This was done by using the very large potential in missile cavalry. We've seen it was something steppes-like. Again, the Mamluks are a bit more gentrified over time. They belong to some sort of more civilized country like Egypt, compared to the wilderness of the steppes where they had been kidnapped or their ancestors had come from in general. But they do retain in this process, in fact, a lot of horse archery and skill. They were very trained, and especially to perform this saturation fire, right, to disrupt, for example, like to soften up at least the enemy charges, like the Crusader one at Gaza in 1244. We see the same tactic at Ain Yalut 1260, Alms in 1281, Shaqhab 1303 that we saw before, right? And the main point, however, was that being the Mamluks heavier, they tended to charge to close in the distance with the Mongols as much as they could, right? They could bring their heavy spears, swords, and maces to bear. We will talk better in other videos about properly that we've seen it already in part, but still for the heavier units of the Mamluk army, like what the panoply really was. There was, you see, the Mamluk emirs had were the heavier elements of their retinue. They had horse archers next to them, right? So they reached the enemy lines, and while they were smashing into the enemy that they managed to reach, there were some specific archers that were tasked with shooting down the enemy standard bearers and drummers to deprive them of battlefield communication. This, especially against the Mongols, was very important, because the drum was, as you know, how the Mongols used to drill their armies to the greatest extent of all these other peoples that just in the Islamic tradition, I made a video about Islamic military music, were very much about drums in warfare, and for the reasons that they had lots of horse archers, they needed to. This was the chthonic telluric element, that the drum rings in the chest, and it's a sort of shamanic trance that it activates. And for the horse archers, like the idea of attacking with that whirlwind and going under enemy arrow showers without adequate protection, but still the capacity of counter-matching them through order and maintaining this very large horse formation, like more or less cohesive, even though they were just light. It was very much about the Mongols that impressed the enemies, also with the martial order that they managed to confer, ideally, at least to these vast masses. The Mamluks were also famous for their early development of firearms technology. I made a video about the Mitfa guns. The Mamluks had objectively the most advanced artillery technology of the era, together with the Venetians. Their naval artillery, for example, was very advanced, with torpedoes, like sort of very ingenious, sort of fireworks style, so propelled rockets or this stuff. But they did have an artillery proper, just for reasons that here I don't want to attempt to explain just per se, because we will talk about artillery in the Mamluk army. We already did it in some other videos, but there are a few examples. In fact, we will cite them now. Basically, they had this, but it was not employed on the battlefield until the very last days of the Mamluks. All right, Kansu Al-Ghawri was the second to last of the Mamluk sultans, also one of the last and most powerful of the Buri dynasty, reigning from 1501 to 1516. During the Ottoman invasion of the latter year, left the largest part, if not all, of his artillery in Aleppo before marching to his demise at the Battle of Mari Dabik. Right. In this disaster, the Mamluks understood how important it was to have artillery available, and they could display their park at the Battle of Raidaniya in 1517. This was just outside Cairo, like so the desperate fight against the Ottomans. The last Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey, gathered all the artillery available, also all the handgunners. There were not many, admittedly, that had not been sent up to that point on another front, that is against the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, and we will have to talk about the theater, interestingly enough. And they essentially the Sultan tried to turn the struggle into siege warfare by taking up a strong defensive position with this artillery in stone emplacements behind a ditch and a wood palisade. Right. The problem with this artillery is that it was very heavy, unmaneuverable. The Ottomans were also instead quite mobile in this context. To obviate this issue, the Mamluk Sultan also deployed roughly 30 ox-drawn wagons mounting arquebusiers and light guns on them. These wagons were called Ayalat min Kashab. He also mounted heavy arquebuses on camels' humps, right? All this would actually turn out to be ineffective for a reason or another. I mean, the Wagenburg was not something that had invented the Hussites. Was used since ever, from the steppes, especially in the countries that were closer to that. and just it's a way of defending, essentially creating this little fort in open ground, that's why this had been born in the steppe, like, because wide plains, these caravans would be attacked often, and they needed to deploy in this circle to mount up a little fortification. But it's not the tactical solution to all your problems. Actually, in this case, everything fails. There was a gunnery duel ensuing with the Ottoman artillery. It was heavier but more effective. There were as many as 100 wagons mounting copper cannon included in the Mamluk army that had marched to Al-Raidaniya. So we're talking about actually pretty intense exchange of artillery. However, you see that the disadvantage of the Wagenburg to an extent here is that the Mamluks, having chosen a static position, are outflanked by the Turks, by the Ottomans, because technically Mamluks would be Turks in orange. And the next day, to make the long story short, the Ottoman Sultan Selim the Grim enters Cairo, right, the Egyptian capital, and actually the Mamluks resisted for like another almost 3 months, but eventually, as you know, they would become subjects of the Ottoman Empire, like Egypt and Syria, under those sultans. The Mamluks do maintain some autonomy. We're not here to talk about this. I made a video about Napoleon's conquest of Egypt that shows you how actually the Mamluk traditions had remained relatively unaltered for hundreds of years, like fighting in a medieval way, still in many ways. And it's, after all, just, not even 300 years later if you count the years. So it sort of makes even sense, just to see how much the West accelerated later on. But the point being, as we observed just here, that this enormous display of technological capacity that the Mamluks inherit also as a florid civilization. Actually, it's the strongest power in the Levant before the rise of the Ottomans, right? That had in part even developed with substantial Mamluk influence in military culture. It's not enough. Like, technology is not everything, even though the Ottomans are, you see here, even superior, right? It's mostly about this functionality of the later Mamluk sultanial state that is very bureaucratic. Its manufacturers are actually not very competitive. There is a crisis, as we've seen the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. You find like a general trade balance penalty accumulating, and it's an enormous territory, very difficult to control, especially this duo Syria-Egypt, right? So the Ottomans, as you know, wipe the hell out of all this very quickly, which is terrifying. I made some videos about this in the Modern Warfare playlist, right? Especially explaining how the West received the news, etc. There is, however, some point to make here. Yes, the Mamluk use of firearm technology to some extent had been very successful in the previous centuries, right? It's, say, at least they had pioneered it, and they evidently cared. There were treatises written on this art, etc. But there are also some, say, again, artillery was not yet what would become in pike and shot warfare, artillery intended actually firearms. As you know, the Ottomans, in all their military advancement, would not have that. The East in general does not quite have it in the way the West has it. There are studies, as far as I know, that studied, in fact, the research, the development of pike and shot warfare by some degree in China and India, because they did have some experiments even much earlier than we think, because there is not much documentation, but this doesn't mean that there wasn't a development, but not to the Western extent. And again, I have to cover this perhaps in a video. It was normal for especially armies based, as you understand here, on essentially still a feudal chivalric concept to also not have a particular, like the Mamluks were a privileged caste of some sort, so it's like when you see the Sipai in the Ottoman Empire hating the Janissaries because those were footmen equipped with guns largely, and they were challenging as the sultanial force of foreigners converted to Islam, by the way, that chivalric superiority of the feudal lords of the Timurid system, and I made a video about this too. So probably in the Mamluk Sultanate there is something similar. Firearms are adopted and used, but there is also a limited chance in development to full integration with the other arms, because this is normally not what happens. Again, also the Persians were actually much more backwards in that regard, but they were still a force to be reckoned with, because at the end of the day, they had manpower, they had resources, and so they could adapt more gradually, also from a technological point of view. There are, however, some myths, at least some fake news historically. They are more like legends or unverified and unlikely things. That is to say, for example, were expressed from within the same Mamluk world, such as in the Furuziyya manual written in this period, that naft, so the essentially liquid fire, like for the Byzantine times, but it was something that existed way before, like it probably from antiquity, right? In the Levant, had defeated the Mongols at Ain Yalut. Right. This sounds oddly Byzantine in the sense, we destroyed the enemy fleet with Greek fire, or with liquid fire, as they called it. The effectiveness of liquid fire was extremely limited. In many ways, it was no super weapon. It was just like this scientific, technologistic bias of the Byzantines, of the peoples that had inherited in part Hellenistic science and treatises, manuals that said, look, we're so advanced because we have this. But the actual backbone of the Mamluk Sultanate was the Mamluks, was the heavy cavalry of the, in fact, of all this hierarchical system, the Ikta, say, service, like quasi-enfeoffment, etc. Without mentioning that liquid fire could be rarely used in open battle. There is one effort of using liquid fire against the Mongol in 1299. This is interesting because it fails, but it was attempted, with the Mamluks leading the attack against the Mongols with 500 naft throwers. Right, so these guys were using some grenades with naphtha, and it was explosive / incendiary. And we've seen how at the siege of Acre, for example, the Mamluks used incendiary devices. It was completely normal, especially in siege warfare. Here you have essentially grenadiers, really, that approach the Mongols. I don't know whether we know if these grenadiers were mounted or not. Right, the Mongols simply refused to come into range, and the naphtha burned out, so that these bombs could not be used. During the 14th century, you have properly the spread of artillery, and we see how, generally speaking, yes, it's there, but when the Ottomans come, there is no real effectiveness that this artillery has, likely because again, this artillery had been conceived mostly in a stationary way. The Mamluks had not really expanded anywhere up to that point. At the beginning of the 16th century, they had remained there, so they had artillery for defensive purposes, whatever, sometimes, as we've seen, even very big, unwieldy ones. The Ottomans, instead, aside from all the reasons why they were a fresher force, had been fighting siege after siege in the Balkan hinterland, which is perhaps the toughest school of, also in the Mediterranean islands, etc., the toughest school of artillery, of logistics, of siege warfare that you can ever have. So they knew how to use it, and also in open ground. So we've seen the outcome. I would just talk about two battles in which we can see part of the tactical info written in the manuals. We have the second battle of Shaqhab, not that of 1303 we saw before, the one fought on January the 2nd, 1390, in which you have a quite interesting engagement between it's a civil war within Egypt, right? You have the royal army under the Sultan Al-Manur and the contendant, the deposed Sultan Al-Zahir Barkuk. And the royal army was here the favored one. It formed the battle array with all the good, like 5 divisions, 3 in the, say, a center with the 2 wings and a vanguard and a rear guard. And Zahir's smaller forces was, according to the sources, quote, not as elaborately disposed, because first of all it was smaller, but apparently just also less, having less of a chance. However, the battle, while opening with the royal victory on the wings, is reversed by the charge of the rebel center, the one of Al-Zahir Barkuk. That at some point, even though being composed of just a few men, like bit more than 200, with the Turkoman and the rabble as the authority tag Rebirdi says, like there were only 30 Mamluks in the center, and the rest were this, as we've seen, lighter troops. Attacked with a decisive charge the royal center and wiped it out after the dust of battle cleared away. Right, to tell you also how this is not a weather condition, but how complicated it was to observe, also to coordinate ideally, as we have seen before, the various divisions, let alone the potential ambush parties or whatever. Right. Al-Mansur was captured in the process. There were lots of that in this battle, but just for saying how even when you had a greater advantage or a more articulated position, sometimes it's these bold acts that just out of, again, evidently moral force or chance or whatever had mixed together, had allowed even the more more disadvantaged force to prevail. Another very important engagement is the one of Damascus, that is the Timurid invasion of Syria, leading to this engagement fought on January the 1st, 1401, with Timur himself fighting an army of 40,000 Mamluks under the Sultan Al-Nasir Farouya just outside Damascus, right? And there is, here the Mamluks lose, but there is a very interesting convenience, that is to say, first of all, the Mamluks were routed on the left. Their right was able to repulse a determined attack led by Tamerlane himself. And this for saying how, say, stout the right could be, right? Eventually the Mamluks are overwhelmed by the sheer force of the enemy, the number, etc. Right? It's actually a draw tactically, but you see that even the best element, right? You have Timur himself charging on his from his left, right, and the Mamluk right holding out. It's incredible, right? This battle 10 years later was finally won by Timurids, as for other reasons internally to the Mamluks the army dispersed, and so Damascus would finally be sacked by Timur, but that's another little detail. For telling you also how let's say the wings, the divisions on the flanks were sometimes central, like even a leader like Timur would attack from there, and we're talking here about a Turco-Mongolian army of some sort that were also with important Persian, Afghan contingents, etc. That was not too different from the Mamluk one, but still was carrying sort of different, bit more Central Asian in nature military culture. So you find parallelisms that survive also in the steppe origin of the Mamluks, like to the same armies of Egypt and Syria that also differed. Like Egypt again was more Western, a bit like in the heavies. Syria was much more influenced by Turkic and Mongolian warfare, even within the same Mamluk Sultanate, right? So we will talk about all these individual battles in detail in other dedicated videos. We will talk about single Mamluk military units. We will try to do things in a big style, complete one, especially like I really care about the completion of the entire picture, right, to understand things better. I was glad to talk about this today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.